just kind of informally talk about these fine-grained data sheets. I'm not going to ask you to come up and present them, but I do have some feelings about how you did and what you did, and some things that I learned from my experience of doing it for over 8 years. And I kind of learned the hard way. And since this was just your first shot at it, and you didn't have the benefit of working with a team like I always did, I always had technical people, engineering, people with engineering backgrounds, people with backgrounds in some of the other things that we were involved in, like people who had a scientific background, who understood the activities sort of from a technical point of view. So you didn't have the benefit of that, and I understand that. So I'm not, if I point out something, I recognize, what you were working with. So I want to start with this, not because it's the best one, it's because it's typed, so you can see it. I didn't realize the decline in cursive writing that they always talk about. When I was a student, and for many years after when I was a student, one of the first things we did in first year was lettering. We had to go through and do lettering, and try and develop an architectural style of lettering. And some of the sheets that were handed in, I just absolutely couldn't read them because they were just sort of scrawled. You guys aren't studying to become doctors or pharmacists, right? So try to carry that tradition that architects have of, really nice, clear lettering and writing. Anyway, this one is typed, so that makes it easier for everybody to see. Just quickly, the general description is meant to be just that, general. Like, to identify for the person who doesn't really know, like let's say, I know in this case it's a bit artificial because an architect, a design architect would be designing this, and the design architect probably went through an education where they had pin-up rooms. So they already know what it is. But if it's just an uninformed member of the general public, they need to know, what is this place called presentation pin-up room? So what you want to do is you want to give it to them as briefly and as clearly and as succinctly as possible. So you would say, place where students place their work on a wall for discussion purposes. Something like that. You wouldn't put a paragraph that says quite that much. Because, and part of this is sort of getting into other issues, like this is meant to represent the quality and ability of the school and so on and so forth. And so that's one word of caution. If you were ever in a position of programming, clarity is really important. Professional, technical writing is all about simplicity and clarity. It's not poetry, it's not prose, it's technical writing. So you're not trying to impress anyone with the flowery language or anything else. Just straightforward, to the point. The generic summary, see, going back to what I said the other day, if you think of architecture in more generic sense, buildings, parts of buildings in a more generic sense rather than a very specific sense, then when you talk about a generic summary, you would talk about it in terms of the kind of description that I used for these multi-strategic spaces. That the generic summary here is large space with, flexible, just kind of, you can almost call it a black box space as a generic summary, because it's a place where a number of different things happen in a number of different ways, with a number of different furniture setups and a number of different. The reason that those partitions out there have wheels is because it's that kind of space, which sometimes is called a black box space in theater, because it's a space where you just have the empty box and you bring in everything and move things around, and it's meant that way. These kinds of things down here, the ones that start to have something like, for example here, time frame duration 4 hours. That's the right way to do it. The duration is, it doesn't do it anywhere else, it just does that here. Um, 4 hours, sometimes you want to put a range there. Like, is 4 hours a maximum period? Is it a minimum? Is it always 4 hours? Because we know that if we're talking about that atrium space out there, for example, the duration varies up to 4 or 5 hours. And so the designer needs to know that it's not always 120 people in there for 4 hours, because that's a constant cooling load that they will then start to calculate into their calculations. Frequency, 3 times a week, that's an average, let's say, or maybe it's not an average, maybe it's the normal. So you need a little more information in here. And this is sort of based on our current studio times. Now, you know, if we think ahead about how architecture might be taught 5 years from now, perhaps we don't have the same kind of studio time structure that we have now. It's pretty inefficient. I can imagine a studio that never quits. In a sense, what I mean by that is that there's a running interaction that is, you know, we're capable of doing that because of technology. And so there's only maybe one concentrated hour when everybody gets together, and the rest of the time you're working at wherever your media station is, or you're doing, and you're staying in touch with the instructor. Maybe you're not in the same room. I don't know. You know, you have to kind of imagine what we're capable of doing in the future. But this is a very good reflection on what we do currently today and what we have done for a while now. And you almost have to pin it down to something, because the designer will want to know, is this event, do the occasions that occur within this room, do they occur at night when it's dark? Because that has a real impact on how they set up the lighting. Is it something that occurs, you know, because this says 1:30 to 5:30, but what about the undergraduate students that are there in the mornings? So it's kind of an all-day activity, and sometimes an evening activity. So you don't want to limit it. You don't want to. If you do put this down, you want to put typically 1:30 to 5:30, but may occur evenings and weekends and mornings. But we know that mornings, this pin-up space would be used almost as much as in the afternoon. So you have to be kind of careful about what you're writing in here. Group size 100 to 150. I didn't understand that range, because we know that quite often it's just one studio section that's pinning up, and that's maybe 15, 10 to 20 people. That's more typical. Yeah. Okay. What are we trying to do there?
At other universities, like FIU, when I graduated from FIU, when we had pinups, especially final presentations.
Right.
I guess I would gear toward more final presentation.
Yeah.
They have a big hall. It's a big space on campus where everybody go, and it's all day, and you have every design pass or group in the school presenting all day in different sections of that building. I guess that was the way I was more or less looking at it, instead of just the little time slots that we use.
Yeah.
You know, trying to give it more of a,
I'm familiar with that way.
Yeah.
I've seen that in other schools. I've participated in that kind of.
right, so that's the way I was looking at utilizing that room.
Mhm. So I think the thing to do may have been, I'm not criticizing you at all.
No, that's fine, I just wanted to explain.
That might, maybe you need to add the word maximum, but that's, in those occasions, which might only happen twice a semester or something, you would have that. But you need to know maximums when you're giving a designer information. Because if you just give an average or you kind of give a typical, you've still got a load problem. Think about both spatially, cooling load, heating load, lighting, acoustics, all those things are influenced by the number of occupants that you need to identify. So group dynamics, what the intent there is that you talk about what's going on in the room in terms of the group. Is it one person presenting with everyone listening? Is it everybody in kind of a seminar situation? So you try to come up with some description there that says, presentations to groups or something like that. And the composition, the intent there is to say students, faculty, and visitors, or and the reason we have that composition there is sometimes you're dealing with special populations, handicapped people, elderly people, children. So you need to know who are these folks that are in this group of people. And again, that has an influence on the designer. The designer wants to know that. The zone here, and that gets back to your conceptual design that you already have. Your schematic conceptual design that came out of your course grain programming. So you end up with some idea of what the zoning is in your building. You have a public zone, you have a private zone, you have a restricted zone. And so here, you would flag which zone does this activity fall into. So when the designer is trying to lay out in more detail all the particulars of where different things happen, where rooms begin to get shaped, they know that this is part of a particular zone. And so that's where the public, restricted, secure, whether it's indoor or outdoor, whether it's a shared space or whether it's exclusively for one particular small group or one group within the population. And the reason that there's a colon here is that very often it needs a little bit more elaboration. Like you did up here, or here. The relationships, this is where normally we would have all of these sheets. And what you could do if you've given the sheets, the different activities, a name or a code number, then you could just identify the other activity here and explain what kind of relationship do you need. Do you need to be right next door? Do you need to be within a 10-minute walk? And so on. And why is it important to be close? There's a tendency sometimes to make everything a proximity requirement. But you have to always be careful because you should only do that when it really is necessary. And give the designer the flexibility to move things around as much as possible for architectural reasons. Maybe for some kind of interesting spatial sequence they're trying to establish in the building. Maybe they're trying to make some architectural quality work in the building, and you don't want to hem them in by a lot of relationship requirements that are really not necessary. That's a danger within this kind of program, that you start to just narrow and narrow and narrow what the designer can do, and you're doing it in ways that really weren't needed. And when we talk about in here, this is a description of the linkage or the relationship, the connection. So when it says link, I expected something like corridor, elevator length, size, the size of the connector. It can be just a 4-foot wide corridor, or does it need to accommodate large groups of people, like if you had an assembly space and they all let out during halftime or during the intermission, and so you need lots of wide doors for them all to get out at the same time. That's what that was intended to be. And I've looked at all the sheets that have been submitted, and some of these comments, many of these comments apply to all of yours as well. And some people have done a better job of certain things, other people of other things. When we get into this part, this is where it's more difficult because there's actually, this kind of gets a little more technical in some ways. And but as we get more and more into using BIM models that can do analysis and feedback and give you readings on performance, this becomes more and more important, especially when you can quantify performance requirements. The space requirement up here is pretty straightforward. What's the minimum dimension? And this, again, you have to be careful because that doesn't look like a minimum dimension, 40 feet by 60 feet. That looks like the dimension. The minimum dimension might be something that is calculated and you actually figure it out. You have to do some sketching and you figure out, well, what is the smallest dimension that we can tolerate for this activity to be performed successfully? And maybe it's 40 feet. That seems like it's already presupposing for the designer a geometry. What if the designer, in their concept, has made their building a series of pentagons, and they want a 5-sided room for the exhibit space, for this pinup space? So you want to keep that kind of flexibility. Critical dimensions, you know, the critical dimension here may have to do with a projector and how far the screen has to be away from, like in this room, the critical dimension here is the dimension from that projector to this screen to get the image the right size. But of course, if this room stopped where the projector is, it wouldn't work for this room. So if we're looking at this room, the critical dimension has to do with the occupancy, how many people are in the room, what geometry of the room still provides good sight lines, and therefore what's a minimum dimension or critical dimension that you shouldn't be less than for the room to work, for the space to work, for the activity. So it requires some analysis, it requires some work on your part as the programmer to make sure that you're not putting in something that is unnecessarily large or unnecessarily prescriptive. You might have to say that the minimum dimension, in this case, may not be an issue. Or you might just put in something like 20 feet. I don't know. When you get down into the clear ceiling height, again, you just want the designer to know in general terms, is this a tall space or is it a standard sort of 9-foot ceiling? And because the architect's design might include a double-story high space, and maybe their floors are 20 feet and 20 feet, so maybe they end up with a ceiling that's 40 feet. So if you pin it down to a number like that, you might, again, want to put a minimum, say minimum or maximum in some cases. So this, what I'm trying to say is this takes a bit of work on your part as a programmer. It takes a bit of analysis, and you can't just stick numbers in there. So the area factor part here, which isn't filled out, has to do with like an assembly space, like a classroom. This classroom with 30 people, 15 square feet per person. So the area factor is the 30 people, 15 square feet per person is the unit area, times the number of units gives you your optimum total area. And optimum is an interesting idea because optimum suggests that it could be a little bit less or a little bit more. When you're talking about the structural part, this was totally misunderstood here. This has to do with the floor load that has to be provided by the structural engineer. So if it's, 100 pounds per square foot dead load, or whatever the requirement is, and sometimes, normally this is not a big issue unless there's heavy equipment, less vehicles are driving on it, and things like that, unless it's a mass assembly space with lots of people. Usually the code requirement meets that requirement. There's sometimes a structural issue with the walls. If things are being hung on the walls and have weight and so on. And even the ceiling could have a structural issue. Very often they don't. The wall and the ceiling is not applicable. You can put NA, not applicable, not applicable. But the floor loading should be called out if it's unusual for some reason. The detriment section, section 7 here, is meant to flag things that really need to be brought to the attention of the designer. And so when you flag something, you really have an obligation to explain what's the deal with it. Like, is it something that is, like if we look at dust, for example, if we think of this space as the pinup space of the jury room, dust doesn't seem to be one of the things that you think of as an issue that the designer needs to think about. Noise, yes, because noise, you want a space that doesn't have a lot of outside noise interfering with what's going on in the space, like we have here. So what you do is you flag noise, and then you explain that noise to the activity, detrimental to, or outside noise should be excluded or filtered or whatever. So none of these other things are special. Electrical interference could be a special issue, although I doubt it. I guess what you could call out under electrical interference is say, avoid electrical interference. But what would it be interfering with? What do you think, guys?
Sound equipment.
Electrical the source of electrical interference would be in this case.
Well, yeah, then, in his spaces, he wanted his space so big that if all those people in there at one time could be an issue from time to time.
Yeah, that's true. We could, like he would say, large group assembly, large cooling load. Yeah, that's a good point.
What about humidity? If you're doing turn-ups, you don't want humidity, you
Yeah, humidity, and here you
know.
could,
Not so much, but you know.
you could say, you could give a range.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want the humidity too low and you don't want it too high. There's a range in which you want that humidity issue. But the main point is, as little should be flagged as possible here. Only really important stuff that really truly could create a problem if the designer doesn't pay attention to it or doesn't become aware of it. So you want to give the designer as much freedom as possible in here. The finishes are pretty straightforward. The floor should be carpeted. There's no impact resistance, no abrasion resistance issues here. We're not hauling stuff across the floor that might damage the carpet, or are we? In a studio, in a jury room. I mean, I could possibly see a situation where we have a large number of models, like a big group model of a downtown, and it's, you know, 10 by 12 foot model, and you have to drag it into the room and set it up. And what about coffee being spilled? And other kinds of things. So I don't know about carpeting. I mean, that seems, you know, it's nice in a way to have that carpeting in there, but if we're talking about a pretty flexible space that has, you know, a large flexible space in a school of architecture, it seems like you want to eliminate any special maintenance problems with it. Now, there may be other floors, like court floors, other kinds of floors that give you a certain amount of sound absorption, give you a little more durability, because carpets wear out, and they just don't look very good. I mean, this looks terrible. There's a seam here, and it's treatment, the thing ripples, and it looks dirty all the time. So I'm not a fan of carpets in schools of architecture for those reasons. But that's my opinion. Now the client and the may insist on carpet. Like they insisted on having the vinyl tile in the studios. They even wanted this kind of suspended ceiling in the studios. The university did, because that was their standard for classroom space. And we had to argue and argue against having this kind of a suspended ceiling in the studios. We lost the argument about the tile. We wanted just stained concrete, you know, wax. So the ceiling, acoustical tile, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of acoustical tile in this space either, because you want to maybe have a lighting grid in the ceiling where you can move light like we have in our, only much better than what we have in the gallery, where you have situations where you want to rearrange the lighting for the kind of presentations that are being made. So that's something you would want to really think about in this kind of flexible space that has to be able to do a number of things. The microclimate, this is where you really, again, would only call this out if it's a space that has some kind of special requirement. Because there's sort of a standard for the whole building, that you keep the temperature within a certain range. Because this is a large assembly space where you might have 200 people in the space, the HVAC engineer doing the calculations and designing the thing takes that into consideration, and designs the space to be within the parameters for the temperature range that, that the whole building is supposed to stay within. Now, there might be some spaces within the building, like the workshop, the wood shop or something, where the range is different, because you just don't expect to be able to cool a space like that, which has a lot of big outdoor overhead doors and things like that, the same way. But what you could identify here is perhaps how much, well, here's where you would say humidity is an issue, because humidity, drawings have a problem with humidity. And we have a problem here in the summertime. And so if this operation continues over the summer, which it does, and may more so in the future, then that needs to be identified. Can anybody think of any really special microclimate issue that is associated with jury spaces, or this kind of a presentation space? Now, acoustics, on the other hand, is really critical. And for a number of reasons. And this is almost needs more elaboration. And this is where the notes section over here, you could flag, and you could flag it and say, see notes. And over here, you could explain that presentations are being made. It's a large group of people. Because, we have problems with chairs moving, people walking in and out, people talking while presentations are going on. And there's a lot of issues with it. And it's kind of critical to the successful use of the space. So here's where you need to identify actual measurable levels, whatever system you're using. And we always try to do that, particularly in the case of something like this, where you have to think about the wall surfaces and the floor and the ceiling, and to what extent do you try to deaden the space so you don't have a lot of reverberation time in that space, and to what extent do you try and isolate it from outside noises, and so on and so forth. So this becomes a real architectural issue. It also has to do with where you locate the space in the building. You don't locate it next to the shop where they're running big noisy equipment at the same time as you're trying to make those presentations. You also don't locate this space in the middle of the building with open balconies from the studios looking down, so all the noise that goes on in the entire building transfers down into the pin-up spaces, into the jury space. Lighting, this is where, again, it's really kind of important, because lighting is so critical to what we do. Sometimes it's important because we want to exclude the light, because somebody is projecting their project, and we want to be able to see it really well. We don't want a lot of light shining on that screen, or whatever the image surface is. We also want to be able to change the quality of the light for different kinds of atmospheric effects. Sometimes a space like this is used for receptions and special events, and sometimes it's a space that you want to have like a gallery show, where you have things on the wall and you want to have floodlights on, or spotlights. So you want to be able to have all that flexibility that you want in any kind of a theater space. And this is where you would discuss that for the designer to know that this is a space that needs that special attention. It's not like this space here, which if we had programmed this building properly, this classroom would not have had this ceiling with this lighting. So here, it's either all on or off, well, I guess there's 2 different levels, and then that's it. So when we get to the communications part here, remember, this is based on early 1970s technology when it comes to communications. And this probably needs to be totally rethought because we didn't have wireless, had not been invented yet. And the only phones we had were the rotary dials. And we still had phone booths. But, you know, a PA system is still relevant for emergency communications. So some of this stuff is no longer really special. What's going on here? It's jumping around. So I don't know how we modify that, like jacks and plugs. Maybe not. The electrical, this again, is something that you really pay attention to in a special, when it's special. Here, this space needs lots of places where you can plug in projectors and computers and other sort of small things. But they're all going to be standard 120 voltage, single phase. I can't imagine a 240 or a 3-phase service being required, but it's possible, so there probably should be at least one in the space. It's not a heavy electrical draw kind of space, I don't think, although it might be in the future. If everybody's sitting there, but you know, they're going to be on battery power, mostly not plugged in. So, you know, this is a little bit different than in the old days when we didn't have laptops, and we didn't expect people to. We expected everybody that had a computer needed to plug it in right away because there was no other option. And there's not any special requirements here, so it's good the way this was set up. So it's mainly convenience outlets. Now, convenience outlets are also required by code, and they're usually mainly for the cleaning staff to be able to clean the floors and so on. Services, in this case, it's interesting that you thought that there should be water in the jury room. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, I was thinking about maybe a counter somewhere for coffee,
Okay.
something like that, so you
What about?
That's a good point.
Yeah, some refreshments and stuff like that set up for a long period of time, so that's how it
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if you think of the space as space, they may have gallery openings and receptions and things like that. Then you want to have a little area that's a place where they can have the coffee and the refreshments and so on. But the rest of this doesn't apply at all because we're not in the lab here. We're in kind of a multi-purpose meeting room situation. So this is the last part in this. And you know, Craig, I think you did a great job here. I don't know what you think today.
No, that's fine. I was trying to understand which one to take.
This is, you know, the identification of the need of a speaker system and some kind of audio enhancement is really important, and particularly if it's built in, so that people don't have to keep hauling in speakers and hauling in podiums and things when there's that kind of an occasion. Presumably, if you have, and you're envisioning this being quite a large space with maybe 200 people, so this is almost an auditorium situation. And I begin to wonder if there shouldn't even be the capability of having a portable stage set up, brought in. And one of the biggest missing elements in this building that should be associated with this building is a storage room right next to it, where you put the extra chairs, the extra panels, the extra stuff, so you don't always have to store it in the space itself. And maybe there's even a portable stage in there, so that it really becomes a flexible space for all those kinds of activities, including, you know, a speaker system, maybe a podium with a sound system, and like the projectors would be more a case of like room 121, where you have a large room and maybe the projectors are set up permanently in certain locations. So if you imagine it being designed in such a way that there's a large display, video display wall with projectors, maybe there's, you know, you can have 3 or 4 different images on that wall, and the projectors, instead of being on carts and so on, are permanently set up, so that if you're presenting your project, you can, you know, present, or 3 people can be presenting, or 4, or whatever. So, but in addition to that, you would want to have the flexibility of being able to wheel in portable projection equipment. But I've noticed now that you can buy cameras that have built-in projection. You can buy video cameras that double as projectors, and they're just small little compact things. So I can imagine very easily where in the near future you have a device that is like my camera. I just bought a camera. It's got touch screen, it's got Wi-Fi, and it's got GPS in my camera, my little compact camera. And all it's missing is the phone and the projection. If I have those 2 things, I don't need anything else. I've got this one device. It fits in my pocket. Well, it's kind of bulky in my pocket. It's a Sony camera that, and it's not too hard to imagine that you guys in the future would come to a jury presentation with something that you're literally, you know, just no bigger than this little computer here, that has the projector built in, everything's there, you just point and shoot, and you're ready to go. You can buy, I've been pushing for a couple of years now for the school to buy these little $200 pocket projectors that you can get, that are just little pocket projectors that can make an image that's 60 inches by 40 inches. And you just plug it into anyone's laptop. So the design teacher can walk around with this pocket projector from desk to desk, plug in the projector, and look at your drawings large, and really give you a much better crit than they can give you looking at your little laptop screen. But they haven't bothered to buy those things.
But
No, it's not the budget. You're paying attention to. I mean, you got this projector all night. I don't mean to be on my soapbox, but that really, they've gotten tired of hearing from me about how that would be really good for studio teachers and you guys. This is sort of the problem I have, Norm, with a lot of the other sheets. And it has to do with, I guess, how it was scanned. This lettering is pretty neat. It's not bad. There are some that are worse. I mean, this attempt here of ruling it across so that these line up. So I appreciate that. And I'll make a real effort to be able to try and read it when I get to that. So you can see why we're not talking about these. And this is the graduate studio, I guess. And here's another one. This one's pretty good. I mean, it's clear, it's well organized, and I don't know what happened to cut off the side here. So I don't know. I know it's the Cyber Cafe, so I know that what that first word is. But this whole notion of the Cyber Cafe is really fascinating to me because it may signal a shift from what I would call informal, or a shift from formal structured instruction to informal, interactive, almost continuous learning and teaching and learning and teaching, so that it doesn't just happen at your particular desk in the studio, but it might happen in the coffee shop because you've got your laptop with you, and there's no difference between sitting at the coffee shop having a Starbucks or something with your teacher than sitting in your studio. Except the difference might be the kind of interaction you have. And so if you look at the model, the Google model, or the Facebook model, or the Microsoft, the Silicon Valley development teams, that's what they tend to do. They have lots of these lounges and coffee shops and pool tables and ping pong tables and all that other stuff. And yeah, they have a workstation, but even at the workstation, they're fooling around half the time or sleeping. So I don't know if schools of architecture can become like that, but it seems to work for Silicon Valley. I mean, it really has a lot of good creative design. And, so something like a cyber cafe, I mean, you could program that in as a pretty important element of a future school of architecture. I would like to be teaching a school that had something like that. So I'll spend some time really going over this. Some of these I got almost at the last minute, so I haven't, not this one, but some of the others. So I haven't had a chance to really, get to understand the detail. But the kinds of things I talked about with Grace, I think apply to a lot of them. And it's just, it's kind of a whole new world of dealing with programming when you get into fine grain, because now it shifts from sort of big ideas and conceptual things and so on down to what should the lighting level be and what should the floor loading be. But those things are equally important at some point in the process, to have a building that really not only functions the way it should, but in every other way is a very successful building. Now, you might say, well, what's missing here are all sort of the personal, psychological, emotional kinds of things. And that's where the skill of the architect, designer has to come in, to not let these things bog them down into treating it as just a technical exercise in achieving, let's say, just performance. That it's more than that. So if you, I think I have everybody's project now, right? Ian, you just gave me yours. So I think I have them all, and I'll go over them and give you comments. Just a few sort of main comments. And I don't know if some of you are going to incorporate this part into your final program, but if you do, what I suggest you do is extrapolate the key stuff from here and type it out on a separate sheet. Don't actually, you could attach these forms, but they are really the rough notes. They're the field notes.
Can you put a copy, just a blank form on Blackboard,
Okay.
so we can access it if we wanna do
I think I did.
It's on there.
It's on there.
that? Okay, I didn't look for it, cause I had, you handed it out.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Okay. All right. I guess that's a wrap.